Ready to talk about innovation that's changing the world and meet the people that are making it happen? Welcome to the Global Code Podcast.
Here, we go beyond the buzzwords, beyond the headlines to uncover the real stories behind technology's global impact.
From AI to clean tech, blockchain to biotech, we are exploring innovations that matter and talking to pioneers driving change in every corner of the world with a focus on people, purpose, and possibility.
Wondering how AI and emerging technologies will shape your future?
Yeah, we're wondering that too.
So we are asking the boldest thinkers and builders we can find.
Come with us on this journey into the heart of innovation across borders and boundaries.
This is Global Code.
Tech for everyone, everywhere.
Hi, everyone. I want to welcome Dr. Lindsey Cameron to the podcast. We're very, very excited to have you. And I'm equally excited to share your bio because, my gosh, what a background that you have. You're Assistant Professor of Management and Dorinda and Mark Winkelman Distinguished Faculty Scholar at the Wharton School, University of Pennsylvania. You hold an appointment in the Department of Sociology. You're also faculty affiliate at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University, the Data and Society Research Institute in New York City, and former fellow at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. You hit all of the you hit all the big schools. It's perfect. I love it.
And I grew up on Yale Street.
Yeah, there you go. I mean, if that doesn't set you up for the future, I don't know what does. A scholar of the future of work, your research focuses on algorithmic management and artificial intelligence is changing and how it's changing the modern workplace with an emphasis on the gig economy. Professor Cameron has an ongoing 8-year ethnography of the largest sector of the gig economy, the ride-hailing industry, examining how algorithm management changes managerial control. You also completed a study on the COVID-19 pandemic, how that affected workers on various gig platforms. And you're currently completing a project on how the gig economy's business model adapts in the global South with a focus on the implications for management and workers. Now, I'm just gonna go to your other page here because I found some really juicy tidbits here. You actually worked in ride-hailing as a driver as part of your research, so I love the grounded research approach that you are. Yes, in the field. Woo, woo. And then you've published 16 papers. You have 2 teaching awards. My goodness, I could go on and on, but some of the things that I wanted to talk about is how you actually worked in U.S. intelligence for some time, and you speak many languages, and you've studied many languages, and you've been to 52 countries around the world and 45 of the U.S. states and territories. My goodness, we are such an honor to have you here.
Well, thank you. It's delightful to be here, too. It's conversation with big minds. So I'm looking forward to a great chat.
Okay, can we start with the intelligence camp? That's the fun fact. I got to go there. I'm sorry.
The intelligence community.
How did that happen?
So I went to a boarding school when I was 15. And I would say the former dean of my high school at that time, I think had gone to school with a former director like many, many years ago. They had gone to high school together, probably like back in the 60s or 70s. So it happened to be that I think I was introduced to him like on one of the sort of like our fundraising trips for the school. And he let me know about, hey, there's this fellowship program where we, take folks who are interested in studying math and science, and we pay for them to go to college. And afterwards, there's sort of like an obligation you have because the government has paid for your school. And at the time, I was really looking at going to the military academies. My brother went to West Point. I'm a descendant of George Washington. Everybody in my family has done military back from the early days of this country. And so, this sounded pretty similar to ROTC or the military academy. And that's how I ended up in intelligence.
Wow. That's incredible. Yeah.
I love how we start with one interesting fact, right? It's like, hey, tell me about intelligence. And then in the middle of that fact, it's like, and I'm a descendant of George Washington.
Oh, yes, I'm Black. You can't see me, right? On the other side of the pod.
that sounds like a whole other story. Like I feel like that's a whole podcast in itself.
I am obsessed with genealogy, with African American history. I've written 2 books about my family history. I'm working on the 3rd one. So I know,
Wow.
from the white side of my family, it's really easy. One can go back to William the Conqueror. But, my parents are Black, my grandparents are Black. You've got to go back to my great-grandparents to find these more mixing relationships. And, I have found the white individuals who enslaved us, like those families. I have found the families that had children with us. And I've developed relationships with all these people, including, my Black family that's all across the United States. So I just, one thing I just love about studying African American history and genealogy is like it's American history. Like in 1803 was the Louisiana Purchase. I have a bill of sale of an ancestor being sold from Virginia down to Mississippi because that was the opening up of the Deep South and where the Cherokees and the other groups were forced to leave their land on the Trail of Tears. The removal of one indigenous group made space for new groups to come in and do plantation labor. And it's just like, I just have this little bill of sale, but it's part of a larger narrative that is American history. And I just think it's so fascinating to like know where I came from, know where my peoples come from, and know that my people's story is everybody's people's story. Like it's all connected.
Mm.
So you're just like a researcher in the truest sense of the word, right? So you study the gig economy and the impacts of things like that, but you're like, no, whatever I'm interested in, the research will be done.
Yes. I was just recently last weekend in Montgomery. It was the 60th anniversary of the Selma to Montgomery and Bloody Sunday. And I was sort of having conversations there with the Equity Justice Initiative I'm working to get a marker to put up for my grandmother's father. He was lynched. And the justice organization there helps you do work to put up markers. So there's a fair amount of research I've done around the archives, around what happened to him. And unfortunately, 2 families that were murdered, they gave him safe passage as he was trying to hide, from what ended up being the lynch mob. And so, yes, I'm a researcher about all things that are sort of interesting to me. And so that includes the gig economy, but it also includes genealogy.
Mm-hmm. And I think it also includes elevating, like bringing people out of the shadows, like sort of uncovering the history and allowing it to live. Just like you talked about sort of this commemoration, like allowing things to live. And I feel like in some ways your work around the gig economy is also about figuring out like how people are moving in this world, figuring out how they're living, how they're making a living, what they're trying to do to sort of not just survive systems, but hopefully, make something for themselves and their family in the systems that were, unfortunately being handed these days.
Yeah.
So I would love to start there. I would love to sort of get a sense of like, what is the gig economy, first of all, just so that all of our listeners are kind of on the same page with you. And why the gig economy? Why do you study it?
Yeah. And before we start there, can you also explain what's ethnography? Because I don't know what that means.
Okay, we're going to jump in for the computer scientists in the group. So this is a really nice dovetail of like my personal history and how it intersects with sort of my research identity. Is my mother lost her job during the Great Recession. It was a really hard time. She managed a large call center that did back-end support for ATMs. And she has an associate's degree. And age discrimination is real. And she had a very hard time finding another job. So I watched my mom go from middle-class income, now earning less than my grad school stipends. And she was working at warehouses at night. She was selling samples in grocery stores, like those little food samples. She was selling, clothes and jewelry at like these fashion marts, these trademarks. And I became really interested watching her and asking her, kind of like, how do you do it? Do you still see yourself as middle class? And she's like, of course I'm middle class. Like the way she dressed, the way she carried herself. And so my research question, I was reflecting on my mom's experience when I was in grad school many years later. And it was like, how do people stop downward social mobility? There's this obsession in American and Western culture about upwards mobility and live the American dream. And we can all become rich if we work hard enough. And I mean, like, look at us, we're on the call. We're all brown people. We know that dream works for a small number of people and not for a large number of people, but the dream is inspiring. And so when I was looking for dissertation topics, that was my question. How do people try to stop downward social mobility? And I was looking at people who had been laid off, fired. I looked at people who are doing gig work because people often go to contingent sort of temporary work to try to be a stopgap for their income. And with conversation with my advisor, he suggested, well, why don't you bound it by an organization? Because downward social mobility is a super broad topic. So just looking at my early interviews, and interviews are part of ethnography, I decided to, the organization that kept on coming up was the ride-hail industry. So many people were driving for Uber because they had lost their job, and this was like a stopgap until their next thing. So being a qualitative researcher it's talking to people. It's deeply understanding the social phenomena. That's why I drove for ride hailing. That's why I spent time in organizing units. I've interviewed the same 60 or 70 workers now over 6 or 7 years. It's living on these online forums where drivers talk, so you can get an embodied experience of their work, but it allows you to speak above their work to what is a social phenomenon, what are social constraints and affordances they're living and experiencing, because you have this grounded knowledge. And, from a researcher perspective, you use qualitative research when you're in a new field because it allows you to develop new theory. So there really was like a perfect timing between like my personal story, my research interest, and then like using this type of method that allows you to unearth new things.
Okay, sorry, what is ethnography again?
So ethnography, it's qualitative. It's talking to people. It's working as a driver. It's interviewing people. It's living on the forums. It's spending time in organizing guild. Quantitative research is all about, let me tell you what the average is. Like if I'm about to give a knee implant, I don't want you to be interviewing people who got a knee implant. I want to know on average, does this work? What on average were the complications? So quantitative research is about variance reducing to get the average. Qualitative is about variance expansion. What are all the colors? What are all the spectrums of experiences? And you can really only get that by getting the seat of your pants dirty, by really getting in the field and talking and living with people. So that's ethnography.
Right, thank you. Thank you for that. And yeah, I mean, I guess heard about like the way Uber came into existence was because of the recession. So I think you just mentioned that. But there is always this idea that gig economy is for people who are using it as a stopgap. So would you agree with that? Like, is gig economy meant to be a stopgap?
Oh, that's some whitewashing narrative right there. They want you to believe that it's being used as a stopgap. But the majority of individuals, this is in a lot of my published research, are economically dependent on that work. And economically dependent could mean 100%. I'm working on for this with my full-time income, but it could be that I'm economically dependent. Like I pay my light bill and I need this income. And the majority is the 80-20 rule. So just for folks who aren't familiar with the 80-20 rule, the 80-20 rule is like, well, let me see if I can explain it correctly. The minority of drivers on a ride-hailing platform are responsible for the majority of rides given. So if you look at like a whole vast, let's say there are 100 Uber drivers, 80 of them might be doing this sort of casual, I'm only working like 10 hours a week. But that's not where the majority of Uber's revenue is coming from. The majority of that revenue is coming from those 20% of drivers who are grinding it out 60, 70, 80 hours a week. So this idea that like this is stopgap work for people that are in between jobs, and that's why they don't need minimum wage or benefits or workers' comp or bathrooms at the airport, it's a narrative that I don't believe, and that the research doesn't support, is that most people that are doing this work are dependent on this work for as part of their livelihood.
Okay, makes sense. Yeah, and I have so many questions about the gig economy, but one thing that I guess has come out is, as you mentioned, right, the whole idea for, in my opinion, any company who's into the gig economy like Uber is that they don't have to pay benefits, right? So that's something that goes into their bottom line. But now with regulations in states and having enforcing or mandating gig mandating ride hailing apps to pay their workers fairly, has them looking into AI to kind of replace humans in favor of AI technologies, right? Like for example, Uber would love something like an autonomous car because then they don't
Yeah.
have to pay anybody. So what are your thoughts on that? Like, where do you feel like that's where we are headed?
I mean, it's the most variable expense. It's like let's figure out how we make labor as cheap as possible, and there's all this reputational effects too around human rights and worker rights and things like that. So I see a few different ways the companies are trying to dodge. Yes, there have been lots of regulatory actions against them. There was a really big one in Massachusetts earlier this year. I feel like I often see these companies complying to the letter of the law, but not the spirit of the law. So it becomes like this little cat and mouse dodging game. And one thing you've probably seen in the press around New York is there was a minimum wage, but then they're locking people out from getting into the app. So is there really a minimum wage if you're saying I can't log on? And so that sort of goes against the original ethos of the app, which is like you can log on anytime and make money when they're having these lockouts. So I think that's one way, like at the very micro tactical level, we see them sort of trying to circumvent these labor issues. Another one is how do they create a reliable human supply chain? So, you see this some in the States, but I've seen this more in my research in other countries, is they'll help create fleet mobility providers that are responsible for helping get cars to drivers. And so those drivers are actually in something that's closer to an employment relationship from the organization they're renting the car from. And then those cars can only be used on the Uber app. But of course, it's not just Uber. I mean, any of these ride-hailing platforms have these similar sorts of relationship. But in that way, they're trying to create a more stable human supply chain. So I think that's the second one. And then the third one is the one that gets all the press, which is, looking at the relationship with Waymo and Tesla and things like that about are there ways to add in different levels of automation or AI. So I think there is the fundamental issue around gig work, which is essentially like the servant economy. How can I get someone else doing what I considered lower skilled or lower valued work for me? And the hard thing is like you got to figure out how to get a human or manage that human appropriately with as little input as possible or little friction as possible to get that task done.
I'm curious, just taking it back to your research in general, just some of your key findings, some of the things that may have surprised you in your findings as you were kind of immersed in the culture and in the lifestyle of this.
Yeah. So I worked as a driver, and I have to say I did not like it at all. I talk about it in my paper and one of my papers. And I think part of it is I drove in DC, which if you've been in DC is like a terrible city to drive in. Like,
That's where I live. Full disclosure, I live in DC, and I'm not going to say yay or nay, but
right. And it was Benjamin Banneker who designed DC, but that wasn't, he's a great guy, great Black guy, but it was in the time of horse and carriages, and it doesn't work as well with the cars. And so up and down North Capitol Street, how many times have I gone up and down that street? So, I mean, DC just has all this congestion. It's, these main thoroughfares. They're also, in addition to traffic and congestion, there are just times where I felt unsafe. I'm taking people that are bigger than me and stronger than me, places where the sun is setting, and I'm like going around rural Montgomery County and like, where is this going to end up at? So I didn't like driving that. And I had all these concerns about whether or not I was being paid a fair wage and if I was getting my surges and yada, yada. But the surprise that, to bring up to the question that you asked was a lot of the people I interviewed really like this work. And it was, and that becomes like the core tension I look at in all of my research, because it's so easy as an academic to be critical and be like, they're exploited. This is, some sort of peonage or Taylorism 2.0. But for many workers, this was the title of one of my most recent papers, it's called The Good Bad Job. When you have a set of bad options in front of you, and most ride-hailing drivers are Black, brown, first generation to this country who have, are still learning the language, this could be the best option out of your set. And so that's the tension I think a lot of my papers grapple with is how do people make this work good, even if there's structurally all these problems with it?
I appreciate that, and it's an interesting point, right? Because you know, especially as a researcher, and I imagine there's that tension, like you said, kind of particularly with this this insider researcher perspective of your own personal feelings around it versus what you're hearing about from this larger consideration set of people
Yeah.
who or rather this larger group of people whose their consideration set is different, right? Because they're
Right.
not going back to another career or anything like that when they're finished
And
with
yeah,
study.
like to point the finger at any of these companies, and I hate that we're just saying Uber because I don't want Uber to be a scapegoat. But to say like you're bad, you have false consciousness, you're really exploited and you don't know that, that is so paternalistic. That is so disrespectful of people's actual true feelings and not saying they actually don't understand their position within the social hierarchy. So a lot of my research is trying not to have that blunt, critical perspective. There's a lot of good things that Uber has done. And there's a lot of way that Uber gets heat because they were just the first mover. And like the first mover, I think, if you're the firstborn child, you got more of the wrath of your parents than if you were the last child. That was a lot more easygoing. And so, that's really what I really push through my research is like to not be a soundbite and to really try to show more of the complexity. And that's why I'm so excited to be talking to you now and sort of having this space is because I'm not being reduced to like one sentence. This is good. This is bad.
Yeah, and I think with big companies and technology companies, big companies that I think get a lot of airtime. I definitely think that it's important to present a complicated narrative if that complicated narrative exists, because I like you. I feel that people do express their autonomy and agency within what they can, and to tell a story and one-sided is to take that away, and I don't
Yeah.
think that that's fair or even real for people. But one thing I wanted to come back to is this work that you're doing around algorithmic management and looking at that piece. Can you talk a little bit more about what that is and how that fits into what you're looking at with the gig economy?
So algorithmic management is where you don't have a human as a boss, but you have an algorithm. So
Interesting.
that hiring, firing, evaluating, disciplining the work. I drove part-time, like on and off for 3 years. I never talked to a single person at any of these companies until one showed up at my job talk like a few years later.
Oh.
So it's this quite dehumanization, but it's like this extraction of managerial functions that's done by technology. And so a lot of companies are doing this now. This conversation about AI just makes it seem like it just started happening when ChatGPT was created. But this is part of a long trend of how do you have something automatic and technical do the managerial functions. And the gig economy is just what we call an extreme case. It's just an example where you can see this really well.
And I mean, what meaning do you make out of that? Is that just about efficiency and saving money, or is there something else going on here?
I think it's a path toward de-skilling. So de-skilling is when you can break work into the smallest component possible, and that way it can be more easily evaluated, seen, measured, and tracked. And so at the highest level, I think that's what algorithmic management does. It's some ways it tries to make work more modular. And I think in many ways that's better for the company. I can't say it's better for the worker, but that's the heart of what it's trying to do.
And then, so what are some of the implications for the workers? Like, were there stories or anything that stuck out for you that kind of speaks to some of the experience that people are having an algorithm manage?
I mean, the one that always drops onto mind is people get deactivated without knowing any reason why they're being deactivated.
Yeah.
And there's no place to sort of have a means of recourse to say, like, you just basically, you go to these little customer service bots are talking to you and not a person. And, it's one thing when you can't get your order from J. Crew. It's another thing when it's your job and there's nobody that you can actually talk to explain. And I mean, yeah, you can see this in ride-hailing companies, but, Amazon warehouses use a very similar algorithmic management technique where, there was these, I'm sure you've probably seen the exposés that were in the Times and other articles about how when there were mass firings of people because they were 3 minutes late for work, or something wasn't shown into the system, they actually had an off day, and they weren't supposed to be at work, but the system thought they were supposed to be at work, and they went over their number of allotted absences and things like that. So I think that's one of the big issues you have with algorithmic management, is that without a real human in the loop and having part of the managerial decision making, the algorithm is just going to have these very hard and fast rules that don't actually match onto human experience.
I'm wondering what responsibility the company then has, because to your point, it's one thing if you're trying to buy something or book a. I feel like I experience the bots the most when I'm trying to book a flight and I'm running into challenges, and it's like, oh, our wait time is 3 hours, but chat with one of our representatives in 30 seconds. I'm like, okay. That's one thing.
Mhm.
But to your point, if this is, a job decision, or do I have a job or not, what's the responsibility of the company to then provide an outlet or a way to engage in a humanistic way with their employees?
Well, this is the fight that's happening in the courts. And I also think it's one of the reasons why I say the gig economy punches above its weight class. It's only about 1% of Americans that earn any income. But everybody knows what this is. Like, Uber is a verb. It's like Kleenex. And I think it's because the implications are so much larger than the 1% of the workforce. And so to your question, I think the standards have to be much different, not even like harder, but completely distinct when you're using algorithmic management for employment, as opposed to when you're doing it as a straight customer service agent. And so many of the conversations about like how these companies want to be regulated, it's almost as if they're service. I'm a marketplace, and people just come to my bazaar and decide how many fruits and vegetables they're going to sell. And this is not a bazaar. This is not a classified posting, which is often how they often describe themselves. Like, it's not a free market. Like, this is a place that's being orchestrated and set by the platform organizations. And so it has to have a whole different set of standards around how it uses algorithmic management because of that. Like workers are not consumers. And if you read a lot of the fine print about how these companies think of workers, they see them as consumers of their technology. And one thing I talk a lot about my research, and so many other people do, is like that they are much more than users of your technology. Like, labor is not consumption.
No, thank you for that. I wasn't aware that there are court battles happening around this right now.
I mean, there's always the very big one that was Prop 22 and AB 5 in California. But I mean, like, Seattle City Council has done a lot. New York City and New York State, I think, had something maybe 2 years ago. And then last year, I was involved in a case that was with the Massachusetts Attorney General's office that ended up being settled between two ride-hailing companies. But it's not just ride-hailing. It's all of these gig companies. People are trying to understand, like, how do we classify them? How do we regulate them? In Spain, there's a law called Rider's Law, which makes them be classified as employees. But it's usually a third-party organization they're employees of, not the actual ride-hailing company. There's some companies with stricter labor laws that are making them classify these workers as employees. And some different countries have different things they look at the gig, like what they focus on in gig work, in addition to labor employment classification. But that's what I'm trying to say, is that's what the battle is in court. Because if you think of labor as just consumption, then like the algorithmic management system for your, if you're buying a flight on Kayak, should be the same as the algorithmic management system on Ship or Lyft. And what the sort of the courts are thinking about is like, well, are these companies really the same? Should they have different sets of sort of regulation and rules they need to stand by?
So you mentioned something at the very beginning, and I'm trying to tie everything together based on what you have said.
That's hard, I know. We went a lot of places.
So you started with something called downward mobility, right?
Yeah, downward social mobility.
Downward social mobility. Let's just call it downward career mobility for now. And this is the way I see, my past 15 years of work experience thus far, right? So we had our parents who were in the same company for all their life, right? And then it came to, I guess, some of our seniors who were like
Hmm.
10, 15 years, right? So it's still
Hmm.
long term, but not really your
Yeah.
whole life. And then it was my generation, which was like 3 years. And
Yeah.
now it's like Gen Z, it's like 1 year. And in between we had like couple of recessions and had the pandemic
Mhm.
and then companies more, I would say more, I mean, they were always concerned about bottom line, but now it's like getting, like, I feel like they can see themselves running without uh, humans, like they can,
Without people.
without people, like they can see it, but it's not there yet, right? So in terms of downward career mobility, like, are we going into a place where, you know, they just need people when they need them and they otherwise they don't really care?
Well, let's hope there's universal basic income if that's what happens, right? Because, there have been a fair amount of people that argue that eventually where we will end up. I don't know. I mean, when the car came along, all the folks who put horseshoes on horses were out of a job, but their descendants got jobs as auto mechanics. So there is an argument that as technology comes in and disrupts certain areas, there will be in a generation or two time, they will find new work. But I think if we're living in that period right now, there's still going to be a lot of people that are displaced. There's a study that I can't remember the author's right name, but it was one of those auto plants that was closing in Ohio or Michigan. And they gave these like skill inventory tests to everybody who worked on the line to help them do job placement. And the number one job that was recommended for people that were working on the assembly line were to become dental hygienists because they had great manual dexterity. That's great on paper. But if you just think of your mental model of who is the average assembly line worker and who is the average dental hygienist, like those things do not compute. Those people are not actually about to become dental hygienists. And so what I'm trying to say, there's going to be a lot of pain in the middle. And I think we're starting to live through this pain. Is there's a societal shift and people lose jobs and they won't find another job that's similar. I mean, for my mother, thank God, it eventually ended up working out. She never earned as much as she made, and now she's retired and she loves her grandchildren. But there was a definite downward shift that she stayed at until she retired. And there's probably going to be something like that until the new thing comes up. And then just the last thing, because I'm an academic and I have to be complex. And one of the things I really like to do is to correct myself and to challenge myself. In a paper, and many people will say a similar narrative that you said, Ashish, is that, it's like our grandparents had careers, our parents had jobs, and like we have tasks. And it's a very like dystopian what's next. But I'm going to say that's only true for a certain number of Americans. Do my grandparents have jobs? My great-grandparents were laundry women, who washed laundry in the back of their house. There's a way that narrative is only true for a small segment of workers. It's the similar arguments you have around white feminism talks about women getting out of the house to work, and Black and brown women are like, we've always been outside the house to work. So I just want to point out like that larger narrative is like work is going where we're only going to have tasks. There have been certain groups of America that have only done task or piecemeal labor their entire time here. So it's in many ways, it feels like we are experiencing things that other parts of America or the world have experienced throughout their entire history. And it's like, for us, it feels like a rude wake-up call, but for them, it's the water they've always been swimming in.
Hmm. I wanted to kind of turn our attention to like the rest of the outside the U.S. sort of go outside the U.S. and a lot of your expertise is outside of the U.S., which we love. And one thing I was curious about, and I'm going to throw something out there and tell me what you think. As we're talking about AI, and one of the things that I was talking with a friend of mine about is, when we think about the implications of AI technology on economies in other parts of the world, there is potentially going to be a very different impact and outcome of AI that's going to take away routine tasks. To your point, people have been doing routine tasks for a very long time. For example, call centers, right? If you replace call center with a bot or whatever else, that entire population of people, now we have to figure out what to do with them, right? What are they going to do with their lives?
Mhm.
And, and then the optimistic side of me is like, yeah, what are they going to do with their lives? Oh my God. Now all of a sudden the world opens up. But then the other part of me is like, holy shit, what are they going to do? Sorry, I just said SIH. But yes, holy shit, what are they going to do with their lives? And so I guess what I'm asking is like, as we become more and more entangled with sort of, and in some ways it's like sort of an extension of this, like, algorithmic management that you're talking about. It's an extension of that in a lot of ways, right?
Mhm.
Of managing people's lives through technology, whether we want to see it that way or not. And I'm just curious, like, what is going to happen to the rest of the world? And is the gig economy going to be seen as a savior? Because I feel like in some ways, is it operating as like the better alternative to all the other stuff that people don't want to deal with?
Oh, that's super interesting. And I would actually like to hear other folks' thoughts about this. So I'm still in the middle of writing this research, so it hasn't like published, but I have seen a fair amount of things that talk about gig work being the savior in some of these countries because it formalizes what was a previously informal labor market. You
Mm.
think about the benefits of that. Like there's obviously tax revenue that's coming in when you have like 90% of your economy that's informal that you can't tax. But I think also at the individual level, there's a sense of pride. I'm hearing from a lot of workers I've interviewed in the global South that I didn't see in the global North, which is like, I have a job. I have this really nice car because the car is nicer. The standards are much higher for a ride hailing company, like in terms of quality of the car than they often have in like taxis or more jitneys. And I get to use this fancy app. I'm holding up my phone now, y'all who can't see. And like, I feel like a professional because I have to interact with this and the algorithm is evaluating me and it's telling me what to do. And so that feels like a plus because I have performance standards. So it's interesting in the South, in the North, we always talk about control and surveillance. And in the South, it's about, oh, well, I actually can get compliments from workers, from my customers and get feedback. So
Right.
I do see there is a way I've been seeing in this research where the work is interpreted more positively because the other set of options are so much poorer.
Mm. And so, like, would you say, like, I mean, I don't know. I don't want to put words in your mouth. I'm not going to put words in. I'm just going to ask the question. Um, is, I mean, where is the rest of society in this? Like, because if gig economy is like the better version for some people in some parts of the world, what are the other versions of opportunity? Like, who's taking responsibility for that? Because it just feels like economic mobility, social mobility, as you were talking, upward mobility, let's put it that way. Whose responsibility should that be then? Because it just feels like if we're just going to give it to the tech companies to figure out, I don't know. I mean, that
Right.
will only take us so far.
I don't have an answer, but it's something I'm thinking about. I'm actually been writing about it all day because in some countries, even in the state, they replace parts of our infrastructure that's not working. There's cities, there's a suburb of Toronto that decided not to expand their bus service and instead gave vouchers for people to take ride hailing cars. But then what happens when the price of ride hailing goes up because it's no longer being subsidized by venture capital? Similar, like you can get Medicare reimbursements and things like that now to get Instacart or rides. And we see similar things in the global South. And I do think I think it is very scary to have public infrastructure in the hands of private companies, just like as a blanket rule. And I think as a blanket statement, and there's not, for the most part, I'd say there's not true economic mobility here. Like there's like economic mobility to a point and then it stabilizes. But this is not at all a systematic or a societal level change, but there's some interesting database I've been thinking about, and I've seen them in a few countries, but I'll talk about Brazil and Nigeria, where I've seen ride-hailing drivers get on social media to talk all about everything there is about ride-hailing and tricks and good customers and bad customers and contests they do. And they've gained in popularity. There was actually one that like I interviewed him and he turned the tables on me and he says, okay, now, Dr. Cameron, I'd like to interview you now for my podcast. But what I've seen in Brazil, which is so fascinating, is some drivers have changed their last name to Do Uber, which means of the Uber in Portuguese. and they've run for political office on more of like a populist background. So I'm still sort of doing research to figure out like what are the actual, implications. But I think there's a very interesting story here I'm trying to figure out about how people have taken ride hailing, which sort of put them in contact with a lot of people, then use social media as an influencer and sort of turn that cultural cachet into a position within the political system.
That's really interesting too, because I just think that we're not just talking about social mobility in the economic sense, right? We're talking about it in the cultural sense. We're talking about it in the sense of how people view themselves relative to their work and relative to, where they can go in a society. And that feels far more nuanced. And I mean, we've been talking about nuance this whole time, right? But I appreciate that you're coming at it from that perspective, because that's fascinating. I think that's really, really fascinating.
And I would say the few drivers that I've talked to that seem the most disenchanted with this either have been driving for a long time, so they've seen a lot of the rate cuts that have happened, because usually when these companies come in, they have to pay higher rates to attract more people. So those have seen rate cuts, and there have been a small number who, for whatever reason, had immigrated to other countries, usually Dubai or Italy, and they had to return home for whatever reason, and they are not excited about having to do this work. And, I'm still sort of thinking through it, but I think there is this way about there was an aspect of mobility that was presented to them when they left the country. And now that they're back, they're not able to reach this again. And it seems to create it makes sense. It creates a lot of disillusionment because of that.
As you've been looking at it globally, have you seen any regions that are doing anything that are unique to that region in particular?
Well, Brazil does not only, but just Brazil has a very unique and long history that I think has made it there's a lot of labor organizing that has happened there. And so there is the political people I talked about who ran for office, but it's the mutual aid groups that I've seen that sort of blew my mind. There are these little stickers that people put on their car that say, "I am not an Uber," which, okay, that's not actually an example of mutual aid, but it's an example of how individuals who were driving in ride-hailing cars were sometimes being either arrested or shut down for money or being kidnapped. And so there were all these little stickers that people would sell to say, "I'm not an Uber. That way, don't come after my car." But an example of how I've seen mutual aid is people are in these very small WhatsApp groups, and they will drop pins of when they're going to go pick up somebody. And so everybody on the WhatsApp group can look to see the pins of where someone's at. And if their pin is not moving, they know that somebody is probably in trouble. Maybe there's a robbery, or maybe there's been a kidnapping. And they will all go out to that location to sort of do a rescue to see what is happening there. And I mean, this is not unique to Brazil. There's Rita Kadri. I think she's at Google right now, but she got her PhD at MIT. She's seen similar sort of things that have happened in Indonesia. So a lot of things around sort of on the local networks and like grassroots mutual aid and support, which I think is really surprising and unique. I've seen in the global South that I don't see to the same degree in the global North.
Fascinating. I mean, just to see just to see how community is created, and then the cohesion of community around various things and various platforms.
Yeah, definitely. You can Google. On YouTube, there are a lot of videos that drivers will say, like, when they go out and like are trying to like rescue or like do like somebody didn't get paid for an order, so they'll all go out and like knock on that person's door and say like, you should pay them. I mean, you can always, there's another way I think you can frame this is about people taking like the law in their own hands and what are the negative sort of side effects about that. And then there's also a way to think about, well, this is a community of workers who don't really have any protection, and they're trying to figure out how do they give protection and solidarity amongst one another.
Well, I think it goes to that nuance, and I can't remember if you or Salima was mentioning, there's this nuance around the stories, right? Because even when earlier you said something about gig economy punching above its weight and things like that, and I think about ride hailing in particular, about how it just impacts so many other things, right? So when it first started, it was literally about transportation, kind of like A to B, maybe B back to A, and then it's expanded to food delivery, retail delivery, just all types of things, which I think in the context of this conversation really hit home for me. I have a friend who just landed in South Africa day before yesterday, got to the hotel late at night in Cape Town, and was talking to the person at the front desk, like, hey, where can I grab some food? And the front desk person said, well, do you have Uber Eats? Like, you can just order from wherever you like. It's magic, right? And and just again providing access to things that where for has expanded the business of restaurants and food delivery places and things like that. So it's this interconnected ecosystem of opportunity that's been created by these things, which is again just fascinating.
Yeah, I have a paper looking at DoorDash activities, and there was a tagline about how they help keep small businesses, small restaurants afloat at the
Yeah.
beginning of the pandemic, and there's a lot of truth in that. And it's what happens when a small restaurant is dependent on now these platforms for the majority of their revenue to help them bring in new customers, and then the fees for DoorDash and it's not just DoorDash. There's an integrated service platform, usually a POS system like called Toast, where they have to buy all these parts, and it's expensive, and they can't use their legacy systems as easily. So I think there's a tension that's developed, and I think the tension is very generative, and it helps explain why this part of the economy continues to grow in all these different ways, because the good and the bad, for lack of a better word, like really feed one another. But I love the question you guys were asking me earlier about accountability, and I'd love to hear what your thoughts are about that.
Well, I was just going to say one more thing, which is that, like, to bit what you just said right now, which is that, like, it seems to me also from what you're describing that, like, we are in this, or what Im Shudan was describing, it's very transactional. All feels very transactional, right? Like, sort of, hey, I need my food yesterday. Okay, let me call Uber Eats. Hey, I need to get a ride right now. Like, let me call Uber. Like, it just all seems very transactional. And this is a very academic question because I'm going into my academic head right now. But I feel like there is maybe a broader implication also around, like, social cohesion and social connection in these sort of economic, like, dynamics that we have with society and each other. And I love what you described earlier about, like, these, in different countries like Brazil, where people are banding together, right, around support and care and whatever. But it just feels like we're moving into faster, more now. And these platforms are becoming intermediaries to make that happen in a lot of ways. But they're not just that. They're not just intermediaries. They're far more than that.
Right. They're transforming the social fabric of how things are done, that we expect to be able to get a cookie from the other side of the town in like 25 minutes. That's to your point. I do think I see the most relational parts of the work in the Global South. And I feel in many ways, I feel like my research on the Global South will, I don't want to quite say correct the research I've done in the Global North, but just show, like, that's not just, there's more than one way that these apps can function. They're just not, you might think you're just pressing a button to get Uber Eats in Cape Town and just appearing. There's like a whole nother network that has to work in the Global South, from how do you get access to the cars to how do you navigate, taxis who are trying to get you, which, I've got so much data from Cape Town. There's so much taxi violence against ride-hailing drivers there that make the work happen. So yes, I would say there's a social embeddedness in platform work that we don't see as readily in the Global North. That's part of the Global South.
Yeah. And then I would say, like, apart from us wanting stuff now, really, right? People used to do these things even before the ride-hailing apps or the DoorDashes, right? Like, the only thing was, like, it was not visible to us, like us in the sense people not doing that work. So, like I would argue, like, other than the need or the luxury that people expect now, like, what do these apps or companies even provide? Because it's just an intermediary. So, okay, maybe I won't get it now, so big deal. Maybe I can get it tomorrow, right?
I think if you have this idea it's just an intermediary, that's more of an econ perspective. And I think it's dangerous because it just looks at the tech and it doesn't look at how the tech is reshaping society in patterns in life. It's much more than an intermediary. And that goes back to our conversation. Like, should they be regulated? Like, I'm going to kayak to get a flight versus actually this is an employment opportunity or a work opportunity. If it's not, I know it's not quite employment. So it's not, I don't see them as being straight intermediaries.
Okay. No,
Yeah.
makes sense. I mean, if they're more than intermediaries, then I accept that, they should be held accountable because they are doing more than what we think they are doing. But I don't know, if people didn't expect stuff right away, I think we were just fine 10 years ago and we'll be fine 10 years from now.
No, that's fair. But there is to your point that this work has already existed. I'm thinking about the work of Mary Gray and Siddhi. So with Suri Siddharth, I think I'm pronouncing his name right. They wrote the book Ghost Work. And it's like anytime, like underneath the ghost belly of AI, there's somebody that's doing all the data labeling, that's doing the content moderation. Everybody here is nodding. But even when you're like going on like an Uber ride, because I was a driver, it makes you take a picture of yourself for photo verification. Like that's going to somebody in the Philippines or East Asia that's actually verifying that's your face and then saying, yes, Lindsey's okay to drive. So I do think like there is something you're saying, like we're not used to receiving, like if we don't get my cookie in 25 minutes, I'll be okay. But I do think there's more and more work that's being ghosted or being invisibilized. And I think one of the reasons why the gig work in particularly has taken off and why we're going to keep on wanting our cookies in 25 minutes or 15 minutes or they become zones is very much in America. Like we want servants, but we are morally uncomfortable about having servants in America because of this idea of upward mobility and anyone can make it. So there's a way, if you think of the platform as just an intermediary, it's like a condom, it's a wrapper and it makes it feel safe and benign and sanitized to have servants. And so I think that's one of the reasons why I balk around this economist view of just an intermediary, because it sanitizes something that it's like it's tapping into so much more.
Yeah, no, I'm with you on that. And a long time ago, I used to watch this YouTube video, and that kind of stayed with me, where this person was mentioning, as humans, we are on the top of the food chain, and we have gone through millennia of evolution to be where we are at. We should not be delivering food or driving cars for others. Like that's something that stuck with me, which I don't know why. And that's why I feel like the economy is just exacerbating the problem.
Yeah, right. So you're like, let's get the drones to deliver the food, huh?
Drones to deliver the food, sure. But also help the humans out to do other stuff.
And there are some points that believe that gig work can never become profitable. That the only reason they were able to come into existence is because they were subsidized so heavily by VCs. So it's to your point, like humans are never meant to deliver food. This viewpoint would be like, well, it's not profitable because it's really expensive. And so that's why it's never become a thing. And I think we're in this question right now of how will these companies really be able to sustain profitability?
I thought Ashish was saying we should be eating less. That's kind of what that's where he's going with that personally.
No,
that could not have been a jab at me because I don't like that.
That's not what I'm saying. I'm from India, and we have exist. I mean, that is one of the few pleasures in life, like eating good food.
I'm telling you, man.
So I wouldn't agree with that statement, but yeah, I mean, as humans, I feel like we should strive. I understand not everybody has the same opportunity, but I feel like gig work is not helping.
Yeah,
and I also think to your point about the food, right? And I'm just gonna like belabor this example. Like getting the food from my nanny, like my grandma, is very, very different than somebody coming and dropping it off in in a bag where I don't even see that person and they're gone, right? Like there is like this sort of separation that's going on, I think, and again, this is transactional nature of how this, to some extent, how this is playing out in some contexts. That I don't know, it raises larger questions for us. So, Dr. Cameron, Lindsey, you've given us so much to think about. I like the fact that we wrestled with this one. We went back and forth. We didn't stay on one line. We didn't stay on one side. We're moving around and getting a more complicated picture about the gig economy and where sort of the technology intersection is happening. We really appreciate that.
Thank you. It was a delight. And I love that last example you ended with, like, food is love, food is care. It's different when it's in a brown bag.
Although it still may be delicious. I've had some delicious brown bag food now.
I'll never beat my grandmother's. I don't care.
Never, absolutely not. Nor mine. So
thank you very much. And we look forward to talking to you again. Maybe we'll talk to you like in a year or two and see what happens. How has your research and work evolved, and how has the world evolved, hopefully for the better?
That would be great.
All right. Thank you.
Right. Thank you so much.
Cheers.
Hey, all. Welcome to our jam session. All right. So, Dr. Lindsey Cameron, thoughts?
that was probably the broadest reaching conversation that we've had to talk about everything. Literally, I think, from George Washington to what's happening with Brazilian drivers in the, who are supporting each other for community and things like that. It was far reaching. I learned a ton just thinking about she used this great phrase about, like I said, the gig economy punching above its weight and really only employing like 1% of workers, but it being just so ubiquitous in the lexicon, in society, and just in our cultural awareness. And so fascinating discussions.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with Shadan. A lot of breadth there, but unfortunately, I think it confirmed a lot of my biases, which means, she said at the very end, right? Like the gig work is something that is not profitable. So I don't know what that means, because if everybody kind of is slowly adopting gig work.
Well, I think she said it was questions about whether it can continue to be profitable without being subsidized. So, but to me, I think that means that there's a place for it now, because there are people who are literally making a living off of it. And, if you're not careful, looking at it from a 10,000 foot perspective kind of takes away the impact that it has on individual people's lives. And people are literally feeding their family and living their life by the revenue that they generate from it. So,
yeah, and to your point, like, when was the last time you were in an Uber? I mean, I usually always talk to the Uber drivers. It inevitably happens. We talk about life stories, histories, whatever. Not everyone, but many of them. And I always get a very different viewpoint from people. Like, I've met people who are like, yeah, like, I came to this country, I didn't know what to do with myself, so here I am. To like doctors who are like, I'm so mad that I have to drive this car, right? To people who are like, you know what? These companies don't care about me and what I'm doing, right? So I think the stories are very varied also about, like, even though you might have concentration of people that are ending up in these jobs, why they're ending up in those jobs, some of that might have, like, there might be commonality, of course, and some of that is in response to society and how we, embrace immigrants and like the struggles of immigrant communities as an example. But at the end of the day, like, it's like kind of you have to play between the systemic and the sort of broader, like 10,000 foot, as you're saying, Shadan, and then also like be able to like get back into like, what does this mean for people's daily lives? And the story is somewhere in between there, I think.
Yeah, no, but I don't know. I still feel, I don't know. I didn't hear, like, okay, when all of this started, right? Like 12 years ago, it seemed like people were happy doing this work. But the more people I meet now doing this kind of work are either, number one, using it as a stopgap. Number two, they don't have any better options. Doesn't mean that this is the worst option, but it is not a great option. And then or the third thing might be that they're just doing it because they have nothing else. And usually when I talk to people, the few times that I have lately, people have not been happy because as Lindsey mentioned, back in the day it was subsidized by VC money. So I guess the money was being spread around a little more than it is now, because now that there are no competitors, there are only like a couple of ride hailing apps and only a couple of food delivery apps, and I'm sure there are a couple of gig working apps, depending on what you're looking for. Now that the competition is slim, the I don't know, and the I don't have a saying, but basically the fangs are coming out, right?
But that's what happens in capitalism. So I'd say the same thing about a lot of lawyers I know, about a lot of doctors I know.
Mm.
It used to be more profitable. They used to love it. Now, not so much.
Yeah.
Right? Profits get squeezed, incomes get squeezed, and all those things happen regardless of industry, profession, etc. And so, to me, that doesn't make it better or worse, or anything like that. I think it's just a reality of kind of how industries develop, unfortunately, or can develop.
Yeah. This is why, I mean, in some ways, I think this is a broader question about the future of work, like I really do. I think that there's something here about, and of course with AI now, this is an ongoing conversation, right? As people get laid off and like, companies are like, what can I replace with AI, and where do I actually need humans and where don't I need humans? And I don't know. I think it's broader than that, really, is a question of like, as a humanity, are we going to really be thinking about like, is profit going to be the thing that's still motivating us, or is there something bigger? And I'm not saying people listen, I'm all about wealth generation. I think wealth generation is very important. I really, really do, across the board for everybody. But I also think that there is this question now of like, where are we going to find our value and our worth, and how are we going to value isn't even about labor anymore, I don't know. These are all messy, thorny questions, I think, that we really need to work through.
Yeah.
And the
And
gig
it,
economy is just one angle of it.
yeah, and like I think I would disagree that this is capitalism, right? It might be crony capitalism or it might be unregulated capitalism, but capitalism was never to be meant to end up in a state like this, right? The capitalism idea always is that there is enough competition, there is a free market with with the apt amount of regulations, right? And the pie needs to be always getting bigger, right? It cannot be getting smaller, because then we are essentially following jungle law at that point, right? Like it's like everybody is just like everybody for themselves and nobody cares about anybody else, right? Like that's not capitalism, in my opinion.
Listen, I feel like this is probably a whole other podcast episode because we could talk about the economist perspective versus reality, but we'll save the discussion for.
I feel like there's a capitalism duke out about this.
But listen, like any good podcast, it should provoke discussion. So hopefully our
That's
listeners
right.
feel the
That's
same way.
right. That's right. So, well, thanks all for coming on. Again, please like us, share us.
All right, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. What an amazing conversation with Lindsey. Salima, Ashish, as always, it's been a pleasure. So we'll see you all in the next episode. Take care, everyone.
Yeah.